Freedom is a pure idea. It occurs spontaneously, without instruction.
See what the Empire has done to your lives? Your families and your freedom?
Good people will fight if we lead them.
The rebellion is spreading.
Now we take the war to them.
The Republic will be reorganized.
Systems either change or die.
Into the first.
You give way to an enemy this evil with this much power, and you condemn the galaxy to an eternity of submission.
To wake up, there is one way. Fighting from the start.
Long live the Empire!
Fight the Empire!
Let's call it war.
Remember this. Try.
Hey, Sophie.
Hi.
None of these are good. These will never be good. Did you hear about the time Luke Skywalker took the overnight plane from London to Manhattan?
I've never heard that.
Yeah, you could say he was... Fucking hell. You could say he was a red-eye knight. Like a red-eye, like the flight is red-eye because it's overnight.
Every time you make one of these jokes, like a small portion of my soul leaves my body.
Welcome to Daughters of Ferrix, a podcast about real-world historical and political influences in Star Wars. I am your host, Eleanor Mueller. With me is my co-host, Sophia Dunstan.
The better one.
I don't think we introduced ourselves last week, but that intro was a travesty, so onwards and upwards, I guess. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming my pal, Fern. Fern is a high school English teacher and host of the podcast Star Wars English Class, where they and their co-host Julia discuss Star Wars from their perspective as educators and lovers of literature. Star Wars English Class has explored topics like queer coding, intertextuality, and the hero's journey as presented live at Star Wars Celebration London this year. Thank you so much for joining us, Fern.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm so glad to be here.
I have invited you for... I have this note in my notes app with just like a bunch of episode ideas. And for some of them, I have little parentheses after the idea with people that I want to rope into doing them with me. And so your name has been on this episode for about 3 or 4 months, long before I asked you.
Amazing. I'm honored.
I would have had to find someone else. It would have been a travesty. So thank you for saying yes.
No problem. Anytime.
Let's get into it. So George Lucas largely wrote Star Wars to be like quintessentially mythic. He wrote the archetypes, the story structure, the aesthetics as themselves drawing on thousands of years of storytelling and iconography. When talking about his creation of the religion of the Jedi, in 2015, he says, the Force basically came from distilling all of the religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs, all around the world, all through time, finding similarities, and then creating an easy-to-deal-with metaphor for what religion is.
The Oprah Winfrey model of religion.
Explain what you mean by that.
Oh, this is like something you can only understand if you grew up like evangelical. Because Oprah Winfrey, like in the 90s, had this famous interview where she said that like religion is like a wheel with many spokes and all the different religions are the spokes, but they all lead to the same thing.
I think that's a deeply like American agnostic take on religion. I mean, Lucas is this guy who is agnostic but raised a Methodist. And I don't know, I'm an atheist. I tend to view like every Christian denomination as virtually indistinguishable from one another. It's very much the outsider's take, the out-group homogeneity bias, where the people who aren't in your in-group, they're all the same, and the people who are in-group are diverse and varied. It's just that. So, yeah, Lucas attempts to make this original, this like essential religion, the Force. Going on in that interview, Lucas says, you go through all the other religions and they... Sorry, I think this is really funny. You go through all other religions and they have the same thing. It's all the same, whether you believe in God, don't believe in God, believe in religion, don't believe in religion. I believe something's out there, I just don't know what it is. I have no idea or what I dare to guess, but I do know what religions are based on. They're human psychological needs that have been put together mostly to create a society. I personally very much fuck with the concept that religion exists to fill like a socio-psychological role. But yeah, this sort of idea that every world religion is kind of doing the same thing, I think is a little bit reductive. Again, it's really easy to say when you're outside of the thing. I'm sure that there are a lot of religious people of different faiths who would take some umbrage with the sentiment that what they believe is like fundamentally the same as anyone else. And I think that umbrage taken would be correct. I don't know. World religions, be they ones that last a very short time or that endure like literal millennia, have fulfilled a lot of different needs and roles throughout human history, and how they arise and develop say a tremendous amount about the specific times and places that they exist in.
This is so interesting to me because this feels like a very Joseph Campbell-esque idea, right? You can see the influence Campbell had on Lucas so clearly. And this was something that I was surprised to learn when I was researching the Hero's Journey episode we did for Celebration. I knew that Lucas was influenced by Campbell. I did not know that they worked really closely, that Lucas saw Campbell as a mentor and as a teacher.
Yes. I think there's a story of Campbell like seeing Star Wars and saying like, oh, he did it. He did the hero's journey, which is very...
Yes. And Lucas read The Hero with a Thousand Faces while writing early drafts for A New Hope. And he said that he recognized some of these elements in his previous work and in his initial draft of A New Hope. And then he went in and revised sort of based on what he had learned from The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And Campbell absolutely saw Lucas as sort of a protege. Like, this guy gets it. This guy is like putting these ideas to good use. So
I will say, I'm going to get on my soapbox here. The idea of the hero's journey is at this point, I mean, it's almost rote when talking about popular culture and popular media. But I think with the compelling narrative of the first Star Wars movie and how that resonated with a lot of people, I think alongside the hero's journeyfication of Star Wars comes a lot of Campbell's like shortcomings. Campbell is this guy, again, this is my soapbox, this is my own take on Campbell.
He's a guy.
Well, that's part of it. I find that Campbell largely approaches his own study from what he sees as a fundamentally, like, inherently objective perspective, that there's only one way to read the myths that he's drawing his theory from, kind of supposing that there is an essence to a story that can be separated from culture, from authorial context. I think Campbell had a bad habit of highlighting the myths and interpretations that fit his monomyth and ignoring stories that don't. This includes how much he highlighted stories about men, from whom, to Campbell, all mythic heroes are, and how he ignores stories about women, who he sees as exclusively the mother, the protectress, or the goal of the hero. That's what he says. That's a direct quote.
It's so wild, especially because he does reference stories with female protagonists in The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Like, one of the first case studies he uses is The Princess and the Frog, right? And like what the well represents and what the frog represents, and et cetera, et cetera. Yet then he doubles down on this idea of like, well, the woman's role in the story is to be, mother, goddess, protectress. There's almost some like, I don't know, he almost ignores his own case studies.
Well, and what the hero's journey is, the like cultural and like wider academic understanding of the hero's journey is itself somewhat removed from Campbell. It has been iterated upon and, simplified since his original, writings on the idea. So the hero's journey is still a thing that has some literary relevance, Campbell being Campbell aside. But I think when Campbell did it, at least the way he did it, I think there's something somewhat appropriative about his angle, where he takes like a bunch of cultural influences and mashes them together and kind of strips away their like own deeper complexities. I think there's a crucial difference between appropriation and misappropriation. I see Campbell's use of especially myths he isn't as culturally familiar with as a degree of misappropriation. So in the book Stories About Stories by Brian Atterbury highlights a section of The Hero with a Thousand Faces focusing on the portrayal of a Navajo character, Spider-Woman, the great weaver who created everything. She's this mythic figure. She does everything from teaching Navajo ancestors how to weave on looms to bring beauty and balance to the world, to supposedly threatening to capture and devour naughty children. Spider-Woman's cool, but by Campbell, Spider-Woman is, and this is a quote, dismissed as a grandmotherly little dame who lives underground and whose function is primarily to help the heroes.
When was this written?
Oh, Hero with a Thousand Faces is like 50 years old.
Okay,
older.
well, that makes a little more sense because, like, if you're going to be an academic in the year of our Lord 2023 and just kind of...
It's 70 years old. It's a 70-year-old book.
Yeah.
Campbell's very dead.
Rest in peace, I guess. But if you're going to be an academic in the year of our Lord 2023 and, like, write something like that, it's not probably going to go over super well.
Well, no, but I mean, not to different time Campbell. He was kind of a Nazi sympathizer when people ragged on him for being a Nazi sympathizer. Anyway, not the point. Not what we're talking about. Not what we're talking about. Campbell's approach on women was itself contentious. He taught at a women's school. I think right around when he published Hero with a Thousand Faces, there were people in his class that pushed back against his extremely gendered ideas about who stories could be about and for.
Every time I remember that he taught at an all-women's college, I lose my mind a little bit.
The line that I referenced earlier where he calls the woman of the story the goal of the hero.
That's like some Freudian projection right there. It's like all these...
It's incredibly Freudian, the entire book.
Well, he's telling the story about when a student comes up to him after class and says, you keep talking about these guys and can't the woman be the hero too? And Campbell relates it in a story later and he's like, oh yeah, this student, she was like, can't the woman be the hero? And he's like, the woman's the goal. She's the protectress. And then I can't remember his precise line, but he says something like, thank God I stopped teaching the next year. Like, oh, these women students.
Yeah, seems like a great guy.
Campbell was a piece of work.
For sure.
Anyway. So in Campbell's work, there's a trend of disparate cultures, notably a lot of non-white ones, square-pegged into round holes in order to proclaim a supposed essential truth of that text without the included perspective of participants in that culture. And George Lucas is one notably white dude with a deeply subjective view of faith, of culture, and of spirituality. He's got some hang-ups. The inspirations that form the Jedi are just that, inspirations in order to create a wider story, but there's a lot of Eastern monistic philosophical tradition as the cosmological background, and he draws aesthetic and structural ideas from Shaolin monks and samurai, etc. And some of those inspirations are limited by Lucas's own surface-level understanding of those things. There is a robust conversation to be had that I hope we'll get to someday about Orientalism in Star Wars.
What do you mean? Because George Lucas's idea of, to put this in like heavy scare quotations, of the Oriental is like very much like Indiana Jones.
Indiana Jones also is an Orientalism problem.
Yeah, it's just like...
Specifically, what is it? Temple of Doom?
These, people from...
Definitely Temple of Doom.
From the east of like Greece are very exotic and they do things so differently than everyone else all the time.
I'm not saying Lucas should be sent to the gulag. I have my own fondness for George Lucas. That's not my point. My point is Star Wars has got some baggage. Whether or not Star Wars features cultural misappropriation, capital C, capital M, is not something I'm going to answer. We can leave that up to our listeners. But I personally, this is just me, I do like to think of the Jedi Order as being at least a bit more than the sum of its parts, particularly after decades of portrayals of the Jedi in various media. The Jedi Order isn't too complex a faith tradition, certainly compared to real-world religions.
What is the theology of the Force?
What do you mean?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm just trying to demonstrate how the Force is not like that complicated of a religion.
Oh, it's just like you could summarize most of what there is to understand about the Jedi religion in like an hour, which you can attempt to do for real-world religions, but you're being...
You're going to offend a lot of people if you try and explain any real-world religion in an hour.
At the very least, you're going to leave some stuff out, right? Anyway, the Jedi, they're from Star Wars. It's Star Wars. It doesn't have as much depth as any real-world faith tradition, but Star Wars has had thousands of installments and even more individual interpretations of those installments. I figure, why not talk about those interpretations and see if we learn something? This episode contains two cultural readings of Jedi and the Force from two different perspectives. The goal is not to figure out what the Jedi fundamentally are. We're doing media crit here, English class shit. We're applying lenses and we're seeing what appears between the lines. So, Fern, do you want to talk about Judaism?
So it is sort of a running joke on my Twitter that I will claim any cultural group in Star Wars as Jewish if I like them. And so I will admit that to a certain extent, this is me applying my own lens and my own perspective and maybe even making a round peg fit through a square hole if I can.
That's what we're here for.
Exactly. It's all interpretive. I would like to start by saying that I'm not sure if Jedi theology necessarily jives with Jewish theology. I think that there is some overlap. I think that there are some ideas or traditions that you can sort of point to and say okay, there are similarities here. And I think again that speaks to George Lucas's desire to create this monomythic religious tradition where I see parallels to Jewish faith, but more specifically Jewish culture is in post-Order 66 narratives, and specifically those of of the protagonists we follow in Star Wars Rebels, Kanan Jarrus and Ezra Bridger. I don't know what your stance is on talking about like struck work. I don't even know if Rebels is struck work because it's animated.
Rebels is not struck work. I will put a disclaimer here. This podcast is recorded during the 2023 SAG-AFTRA strikes. None of Star Wars on-screen presence could exist without the work of the actors who are currently on strike, particularly the people who appear in and work for live-action productions.
Absolutely. Thank you. In this way, so this is a similar claim that I've made about the Mandalorians, that Mandalorian culture has a lot of resonance with Jewish experience and that they are a diaspora culture, especially as we see them sort of later on in the history of the galaxy. And similarly, of post-Order 66, Jedi culture is a diaspora culture. It is one that has required adaptation and at times secrecy and subtlety to survive. I think that Kanan Jarrus is a really good example of the ways in which a culture can be adapted in order to survive in times of adversity. And I think like especially the relationship between Kanan Jarrus and Ezra Bridger speaks to the Jewish tradition of, it's called Lador Vador, which is the idea of like passing the culture, the traditions of faith down through the generations, and that this is sort of a duty we have as Jewish people.
Would you mind if I recapped some stuff about Kanan for Sophie?
Yeah, absolutely. Please do.
Kanan is a survivor of Order 66. He basically takes to not just a life of crime, but he does whatever he needs to survive after getting away from some clones. Don't worry about it. And Kanan spends decades living as, not a Jedi, until eventually he bonds with someone else who has, shall we say, anti-imperial sentiments and forms a little rebellious crew that forms the cast of...
Rebellious polycule.
Rebellious... some of them are a little young for that, Sophie.
Well, it's polycules can have kids.
Not legally.
Have kids. Not like in the thing. I need to make that very clear.
That's a good caveat. Oh my god. Sure.
In the same way that two traditional parents can have kids.
Yeah. Continuing on. And Kanan Jarrus, of course, takes under his wing a little, 14-year-old Force-sensitive kid and trains him to be a Jedi like Kanan. Obviously, that's not the same as the way in which Jedi masters, as knighted by the temple, train people to be Jedi Knights. But Kanan's the real deal. Ezra's the real deal.
I'm beginning to see the parallels to Judaism here.
Good. So I think in general, the Jedi are a culture existing post-genocide under a fascist regime. Like, there are going to be clear parallels and resonances with Jewish experience. I think anytime you have a fantasy culture that exists under those parameters, there are going to be parallels you can draw between the fantasy culture and Judaism. I think this resonance is especially noticeable in Star Wars Rebels because Rebels is such a Jewish show. I mean that in a couple of ways. So I think like spiritually or ideologically, it's a Jewish show, and I can talk a little bit more about that later. But also just in terms of like world building and set dressing and aesthetics, most of Rebels, or at least a good portion of Rebels, takes place on a planet called Lothal. Lothal very much becomes the sort of focus of the show's attention. The show sort of begins on this planet and ends on this planet, and much of the arc of the show revolves around the liberation of this planet from Imperial control. And Lothal is a really Jewish-looking planet.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, excellent question. I mean, the culture of Lothal looks a lot like Jewish culture. We see women, married women specifically, who cover their hair. Ezra's mother covers her hair. You look at a character like Ezra, like a lot of the other people on Lothal, they have similar ethnic features to ethnically Jewish people, especially Mizrahi Jews, and their names are also very, very Jewish. So I remember being excited the first time I watched Rebels to hear Ezra's name, but also to hear his parents' names, Mira and Ephraim, because these are the names of people I, went to temple with growing up. These are names that I hear in services every week when I go to services, which, to be honest, it is not every week. But these are names that have a lot of cultural identity University. The name Ezra is a Hebrew name that means help. Like it's quite literally the Hebrew word for help. And I think that is a intentionally selected name. I think both in terms of identifying Lothal with Jewish communities, that name is intentional, but I also think that that's the role he plays, right? Like he learns to help not just himself, but help others, help those around him, and ultimately, help free his planet from imperial control.
Well, yeah, that's his self-actualization, is becoming this guy who goes from looking out only for himself. I mean, he's a kid, I don't blame him, but to being something of a champion for the people and ultimately sacrificing himself for that.
Exactly. And so I think making this character, Ezra Bridger, who has a Jewish-sounding name and parents with Jewish-sounding names, and whose story is reminiscent in a lot of ways to stories we hear from Holocaust survivors. So this was another thing I thought about a lot the first time I watched Rebels. Ezra Bridger is 7 or 8 years old when he comes home one day to find that his parents have been taken by Imperial forces. He doesn't know what happened to them. For a long time, he assumes that they're dead. And this story really impacted me because it was a story I had heard from Holocaust survivors in the past. This exact story of, I came home, my parents were gone.
That's horrific.
It's very grim, yeah.
Yeah. I think that that's intentional. A lot of the people who worked on Rebels have Jewish backgrounds. So again, like a lot of this feels intentional. And it just serves to sort of highlight these parallels, right? And serves to highlight the similarities between the Jedi culture and Jedi religion post Order 66 and, Jewish culture as it exists today and how it existed some 70 years ago in Europe.
But I mean, Judaism is, and believe me, I'm no expert, but Judaism is a religion that, y'all find so much community in sort of collective suffering throughout history in this way that, you kind of have to if you're going to endure as a faith tradition through so much hardship and so much like genuine oppression. I think it makes a lot of sense for us to see that in a post-genocide religious order like the Jedi.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that's sort of that I find remarkable about Judaism is the ways in which traditions have been preserved for thousands of years and the ways in which traditions have changed and shifted. And I don't want to say anything that's going to get me in hot water because I don't have a strong theological background. And so I might say things that are a little bit misguided here and are simply my understanding. But I think of, something in the Reform community here in America, patrilineal Jews being considered just as Jewish as matrilineal Jews, right? If your father is Jewish, you're Jewish. For a long time, this was not the case. And in fact, in many Jewish communities here and around the world, that's still not the case. If your mother was not Jewish, you are not considered Jewish. Accepting patrilineal Judaism is a survival tactic at some level, right? This is a religion that for many reasons has sort of, in terms of population has sort of diminished. And then in terms of a culture that has in large part assimilated into, American culture and European culture and worldwide. How do you preserve the religion? How do you preserve the tradition? Well, you make it as easy as possible to do that, right? You don't put up these barriers to entry. Again, that might be sort of misguided, but that's my read on the situation as a patrilineal Jew.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Not my place to have a huge opinion on that, but again, that's something, that sort of adaptation is something that we see from the Jedi, where during the time of the institution of the Order, to become a Jedi Knight is a process that you undergo trial for, and you are knighted. But someone like Luke just found some books and said, I don't know, I'm a Jedi Knight now. And frankly, that's what you gotta do when you're the only one of your kind that you're talking to.
Yeah.
The Jedi Order endures through him because Luke is willing to say, okay, well, I'm not the best of the best in history at this, but I care about this. This is who I am. This is my culture.
Exactly.
This is my identity. And I am going to carry that legacy, even if I wouldn't necessarily be ready or accepted by the original institution itself. Yoda rejects him as a student initially because he's not the way they used to do things. And Yoda changes his mind.
Yes. Also a very Jewish thing. So in Judaism, if you convert, so my mom converted to Judaism when I was about 12 years old, and she raised my brother and I Jewish, but she wanted to make that process official, and in part so that my brother and I would be accepted in any Jewish community as Jews. And
that's really sweet.
Yeah, it was. But when you convert, you need to ask 3 times if you can convert, if you can become a Jew. You have to ask a rabbi, and they have to say no 3 times. You have to really want it. You have to be turned away and come back to it on your own, which is exactly what Luke does. He's turned away from it and he comes to it on his own and, eventually meets that acceptance. But yeah, I was thinking of what you said earlier about how Ezra is a sort of untraditional Padawan, right? He's 14 when he begins training as a Jedi, and
his first lightsaber is a gun.
Yeah, and his first lightsaber is a gun. And this, of course, makes sense, right? Like, if the surviving Jedi post Order 66 said, well, we can only train kids starting when they're 4 years old, and if they're any older than that, they're too old, and it can't be done, the Jedi religion would have died out.
Like, immediately.
Immediately, within a few years. Yeah, Luke can, continue to perpetuate this tradition because he is trained at 19 years old, which is very different from how things used to be. So I see those similarities, those adaptations as parallels to the way, I'm sure this also rings true for other cultures that have been the victims of genocide, that adaptation is necessary to survive.
I also think it's kind of interesting how the overall narrative structure of the Jedi as an institution throughout kind of the whole of the 11 movies Skywalker saga is kind of how closely that sort of parallels historical Judaism from before, even the destruction of the Second Temple. We have this sort of initial buildup of an institution and then kind of a departure into exile and then a return and then a departure into exile again. And that is kind of interesting, and I think maybe not entirely coincidental that that's how the Jedi developed.
100%. And I think, again, I said I wasn't going to speak much about theological parallels, but I think they do exist. I think that there's a reverence for life and the sanctity of life and things of that nature. I also think that Jedi tradition and Jewish tradition are both sort of defined by rules, right? Are sort of defined by what you do, maybe more so than what you believe. Yet those rules can be questioned, or at least, what we see, especially in the High Republic era, there's room for interpretation, there's room for debate, there's room for flexibility.
Jedi doctrine is not rigid.
Right, exactly. And I think people perceive it as very rigid, but I think a lot of the time that's because people are maybe carrying their own experiences with religion into their interpretation of the Jedi, just as I am. Or I think of this scene in Master and Apprentice, I believe, by Claudia Gray, where Qui-Gon is talking to Rael Avros, and Qui-Gon has just walked in on Rael in a compromised position, shall we say, and gets sort of
putting the rail in Rael Avros. Yeah.
Exactly. And, is sort of offended by this and calls him out on it. And, how could you break your vows like this? And Rael's like, no, this is without attachment, without feelings. This is just, having some fun, essentially. You, on the other hand, you have fallen in love before. That is, I might be breaking the letter of the law, but I'm following the spirit of it. You, on the other hand, you might not have made that connection physical, but you have committed a more severe transgression, essentially. And there's room for nuance and debate in interpretation of Jedi doctrine.
Well, and we see when that flexibility goes away, that's when the Jedi are at their most, both vulnerable and at their fallen state. When the orthodoxy is greater, when you have only 2 and 1 exception colors of lightsaber, because who and what a Jedi is and believes becomes such a narrow line.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that. I think that's absolutely the case.
I do want to say that's some not to bring the Christian into the room for a sec, but that's some Jesus ass shit right there, to just be oh, well, you committed the sin in your head, so that's worse than me actually doing it.
It's taken us about a half an hour podcast time to get to talking about Jesus Christ in the talking about Judaism section, so
it was bound to happen. Actually.
Well done.
He was Jewish.
He was Jewish. Really the most famous historical Jew.
So true.
I don't like that, but it is true. So I feel like someone who started another religion should not be the most famous Jewish person, just from a representation standpoint.
The most famous Jedi is Darth Vader. So that seems Whatever, I'm not Christian. That's not blasphemy. That's not.
No, but it is heresy.
It's not heresy. Is it really heresy if you don't believe? Anyway, moving on.
I think that is it. I think, I could talk about all of this for a long time, but it would be unstructured and unproductive. So let's move on to the next section.
Absolutely. Well, and frankly, if I could maybe someday get you back on when we talk about Mandalorian culture, that would be amazing.
I have so much to say about Mandalorian parallels to Jewish culture and religion. There is so much there, and I would be so thrilled to come on and speak about it.
Well, I would love that. Okay, let's pivot. Second, we're going to talk about neurodivergence. Man, I'm going to try to do this the best as I can, but I'm not a mental health professional. I'm not any kind of professional,
I'm
actually.
a professional at having mental health problems.
You get paid for that?
I mean, if they get bad enough by the government, yes.
Anyway, not a professional. I am a person who has, shall we say, experienced a lot of neurodivergence both in my own life and with the people around me. And centering those perspectives is deeply important to me. First, let's define the word. Neurodivergent as a term was coined by the 1990s sociologist Judy Singer specifically as an alternative to language popularized prior, which often framed atypical neurological conditions as inherently deficit or disordered, which is the way they're still often treated in medical contexts today. I mean, the clinical names for a lot of neurodivergent conditions have like disorder in the name. To be neurodivergent is to be a person whose brain processes various types of information and stimulus in a way that is seen as non-normative. This includes people on the autism spectrum, people with other learning disabilities, those who experience difficulties with intense anxiety or varied attention, obsessive-compulsive behavior, and even stuff like Tourette's or epilepsy and Down syndrome. And of course, any combination of the above. These conditions are almost always a fundamental part of the people who experience them and can radically affect the way those people experience the world, sometimes negatively, often to the point of very real disability. The world largely isn't built by or for neurodivergent people. And so being expected to function socially, mentally, emotionally in the same way as neurotypical people when you aren't that can be debilitating. But alongside that genuine difficulty, many neurodivergent people find deep meaning and identity in who they are and in the ways that their mind works, as is their right as individuals who deserve to determine who they are and the shape of their lives. All that said, there's our groundwork. Let's talk about Anakin fucking Skywalker for the first time. We've talked about Vader, but let's talk about the actual guy.
Let's do it.
Do you think Anakin liked trains?
For sure.
I feel really confident that Anakin liked trains. We'll get there. So I think it can be somewhat, shall we say, unhelpful to look at media through the lens of diagnosis. A fictional character isn't as three-dimensional as we real human beings are. We have obscenely complex brains. We have dozens of years of data input and processing. A diagnosis, ultimately, at least ideally, if you ask me, is a tool, a way for someone to receive the sort of treatment they need in order to better navigate the world. So when we're talking about someone like Anakin, I'm not trying to diagnose him. We're not decoding him. I'm not trying to figure out the secret truth of his character. I'm trying to read Anakin through a lens I feel is appropriate for his portrayal and potentially enlightening. That being said, it is somewhat common, particularly among Star Wars fans of younger generations, to read Anakin Skywalker and his portrayal in the 3 prequel films as experiencing some kind of neurodivergence, especially as being autistic. Autism refers to a variety of conditions that relate to the development of the brain. It's estimated that 1 in 100 people has autism or is somewhere on the autistic spectrum, which is a minority, but still, that's a lot of people. Autistic people approach social communication differently than their neurotypical peers and may tend to take things more literally or process information at a different pace than others. Autistic people often have a heightened sensitivity to certain lights, sounds, or touch, and can be easily overstimulated and overwhelmed by the things they're sensitive to. When a situation gets to be too much for an autistic person, they can experience a loss of behavioral control where they lash out, they melt down, or switch off. They might exhibit repetitive behavior and movement, including self-stimulatory practices like fidgeting, hand flapping, or movement when sitting down. Also, they may really thrive within routines, and on the flip side, changing that routine can be really stressful for an autistic person. Autistic people can show a high level of focus towards things that they are interested in. This is where the idea of special interests come from, right? A stereotypical one that the internet likes to highlight is trains. Like, this comes up so often, which I mean, yeah, I see that from a lot of my neurodivergent friends.
Later, she looked over at me when she said that.
Okay.
You know that?
Moving on. But this level of investment often leads to a deep and expert knowledge of particular topics and a tremendous use of time towards pursuing the interest itself. A person can express a lot of these indicators and not necessarily be autistic. And an individual autistic person's mileage may vary. Again, we're just trying to get a sense of recurring motifs here. Right from the off, we can see a lot of potential. Anakin is someone who has very specific interests. He expresses himself through his work on machinery and as a pilot. As a 9-year-old, he reconstructs a functional protocol droid from disparate parts, and he builds a pod racer. He wins the fucking Boonta Eve Classic, his first try. You can imagine the amount of, fixation this would take from a kid that young. After Anakin's mom dies when he's 19, he goes, straight to a workbench after killing some guys, and tells Padme that life seems so much simpler when you're fixing things. In the Legends novel Rogue Planet, Anakin says that he doesn't meditate very often in the way that other Jedi do, that he gets to a certain point and he just overloads. But fixing things for Anakin seems to be a meditative, stimulatory process in its own right. The lack of control over his life that Anakin experiences, first as a slave and then under Obi-Wan, seems to make it harder for Anakin to regulate his emotions, and when Anakin is knighted during the war, he largely thrives in the field, and he has the space and freedom to see to his own emotional and mental needs. And during the Clone Wars, Anakin often solves problems in unorthodox and creative ways. Anakin's very sensitive and awkward as a teenager. He deals with his discomfort sometimes by fidgeting, sometimes avoiding eye contact, sometimes making a little too much eye contact. Anakin fucking hates sand, and he finds it sensorially uncomfortable, and he also lacks the social awareness to already know that sharing that fact isn't exactly a great pickup line. Well, it worked. It turned out for him, but at what cost?
Because
it works. It works. That doesn't mean it's good.
The first thing I always walk up to everyone who I want to date is just like, "Hi, name's Sophie. I hate sand," and they're just like, "Marry me."
They give you their number on the spot. They propose
so true.
to you. Yeah. Anyway, when Anakin and Padme are on a covert mission in the Clone Wars, Padme flirts with Rutch Clovis, a guy that she used to be into, as a tactic to get him to trust them. Anakin cannot tell that this is an act. Anakin has no idea, even though they are on the mission together. Anakin is a person who is best described as intense. He's given the through-line metaphor between legends and canon of a sun dragon, a mythological creature that personifies the strength of his heart, his passion. Again, referencing Rogue Planet, Anakin has an outburst when talking to Mace Windu, where he says the words, "I burn like a sun inside." In the Revenge of the Sith novelization, the sun dragon also becomes a symbol of Anakin's crippling fear of the loss of his loved ones. Anakin is a person who gets very attached to people in his life that he feels safe with. Padme, Obi-Wan, R2-D2, at different points, he believes he's lost all three of these people, and he does not handle it well. The way he sees morality is clear. He deals in absolutes. He sees moral thinking as black and white, with a deep commitment to what he sees as good. The Republic is good, the Separatists are evil. When Palpatine convinces him to lead a genocide, Palpatine is good, the Jedi are evil. Autistic people often experience a strong sense of fairness, of justice, and of fidelity to the people and objects they value. Betrayal to or aberrance from those preconceptions can lead to a very intense reaction from an autistic person. Okay, a caution I see as being essential to adopt when talking about the mental states of people outside of yourself is that a mental disorder, quote unquote, is only most probably applicable when there's an absence of external factors that could explain these same behaviors. Anakin is a deeply traumatized kid.
What do you mean? He was owned as a slave? Oh, I don't see how that could traumatize everyone.
Waking up every morning knowing that there's an explosive in your head that Watto could just roll over the remote in his sleep. Yeah. He grows up as a slave. He's separated from his mom when he's 9. He goes and trains with, frankly, an underqualified, barely Jedi Knight. I love Obi-Wan, but he's not really ready for it. And then his mom dies in his arms. Anakin's not a guy who's okay by any metric. But again, this is not the point. The question is not, is Anakin Skywalker literally autistic? It'd be cool if he was. Literal representation matters. Shout out to Tech from the Bad Batch here. But that's not what we're here for. We're playing the cultural readings of the Jedi game. So let's see if we learn something from that cultural reading. The feelings of alienation, of difference that Anakin experienced from being a part of a Jedi Order that did not treat him as equal are something that we often see in stories about Jedi characters that end up turning to the dark side. And that's a descent that's usually directly tied to emotional and mental needs going entirely unmet.
Count Dooku, our neurodivergent king.
Count Dooku left for political reasons.
Well, that's the reason you would leave.
That is the reason I would leave the Jedi Order. Dooku's... We talked about this last time. This is not the point. Moving on. Iskat. Iskat is the main character of the canon book Inquisitor Rise of the Red Blade. She comes of age during the Clone Wars just like Anakin and feels estranged from the rest of her order. None of her elders are really willing to meet her where she's at as a kid or as a teenager. They don't take her grief at the loss of her master seriously or validate her other emotional needs. Iskat comes to see herself as someone who only feels comfortable in combat, who only feels like herself when she's fighting with a lightsaber. Repeatedly throughout the book, she mentally returns to her experience of the Battle of Geonosis, where she killed like a shit ton of Geonosians in defense of her fellow Jedi, being one of the only times that she feels at peace with herself. But there's one other times that she thinks of as being mentally quieting in the same way. On a dangerous mission, where she and 2 other Jedi Knights have to scale a sheer cliff face, Iskat feels mentally stimulated by the work of climbing. This is mentioned once in the book, and I swear I just fucking latched onto it. The author's note to Inquisitor describes the author Delilah S. Dawson as herself neurodivergent and writing in some ways from that perspective, and I think it makes a lot of sense to see Iskat's struggle as similar to someone with ADHD. ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Again, we come back to the ideas of deficit and disorder. Not great. A condition wherein a person tends to vary from the attentive or active norm. ADHD is often characterized by an inability to sit still, which might be expressed through fidgeting or other movement, a tendency to get easily distracted from other things, a degree of forgetfulness around tasks, including self-care, a degree of impulsiveness, risk-taking behavior, and impatience. Again, it's more complicated than that, but we're looking at commonalities and signs. Diagnosis rates for ADHD can get quite high. As many as 1 in 10 kids in the US may experience it. For those ADHD kids who are especially ill-suited to, say, an American classroom environment, the treatment they receive for that nonconformity and quote-unquote difficulty can take its toll. On the flip side, a lot of ADHD people really thrive in settings where they can be active or stimulated in the ways that best fit them. Iskat just isn't someone who's content sitting idle when she could be out on her feet. Her master was someone who spent her days researching artifacts and reading stuffy ancient treatises and expected her Padawan to do the same, when Iskat wanted to be on missions out in the world. After the aforementioned climbing mission went awry, Iskat is barred by the Jedi Council from participating in any wartime field missions, and instead she spends years stuck at the temple, training in combat, fixated on the war, and itching to get out to participate, to be satisfied. But instead her needs and indeed her potential go unfulfilled. Iskat eventually embraces the dark side of the Force and becomes the 13th sister in the Imperial Inquisitorius. There's an obvious degree of personal choice here, right? No one made Anakin kill a bunch of kids. Iskat could have not been an Inquisitor. They each bear some responsibility for that. But these are stories that are also about the failure of the Jedi Order as an institution to account for and look after characters that we see as having difficult mental experiences and specific needs that come with them. Anakin and Iskat are both naturally deeply powerful in the Force. So with this, maybe we should also see them as some of the most neurodiverse, the most vulnerable people at the temple.
So would you say that Yoda is like neurodivergent then, since he's quite powerful in the Force?
Probably. Yoda's his own guy. You know, Yoda's a silly little man. I think Yoda is a neurodivergent king, frankly. These structural fuck-ups go hand in hand with the larger narrative portrayal of the Jedi Order during the Clone Wars being a spiritually fallen institution, lost from its purpose of training stable, fulfilled Force sensitives to help themselves and the world around them.
This is interesting, though, because I've thought for a long time, like, I am a Jedi apologist through and through.
Absolutely.
And I, for a long time, have thought about how the parallel to me is the Jedi Order reminds me of the public education system in this country, in that I am a firm believer in the importance and the necessity of this system. And also, I understand firsthand how deeply flawed it is. students. And I think there are parallels here as well in the ways that public schools in this country fail neurodivergent students every single day. I think you're right to point out the ways in which the structures and the systems of the order fail people like Anakin, who have different needs from his peers.
I think you're absolutely right about the Jedi Order at that specific time being an institution that fails to support the most vulnerable people in its ranks. But I think we can also contrast that with the time in canon when the Jedi Order was at its height, that is, the High Republic, where we see a myriad of examples of Jedi who have specific needs and come from disparate backgrounds and still find meaning and community in the halls of the Jedi Temple. Ram Jamaram is a Jedi Padawan who sees the Force itself through the lens of his passion for mechanized things, his fascination for engines and droids and tools informing the ways in which he expresses himself as a Jedi. He's a great mechanic, but isn't as refined a swordsman like some of his peers. He hates conflict on like an emotional level. As it says in the StarWars.com databank, for Ram, mechanics are meditation. Ram is a super sweet kid, but he's deeply introverted. He vastly prefers to spend time alone working in a garage, and he can struggle socially, and he does, until he meets the right people who accept him and his interests for what they are. We can see Jamaram as like an obvious corollary to Anakin. They share a common interest and a similar outlook on meditation. What if Anakin's master had seen his talents and passions as a mechanic and a pilot and encouraged Anakin to channel himself and his connection to the Force into them? Sippa Tarko is a youngling who's considered unusually gifted for her age. I don't know how old she is. I think she's like between 6 and 8 years old, but she has fairly precise control over physical Force abilities. She's pretty good at telekinesis. She has pretty fast reflexes, but she's also considered difficult. She's belligerent, she's overconfident, and she asks a lot of questions and doesn't always act socially in ways others would expect.
So she's like one of those 5-year-olds that can like play Beethoven on the piano.
Kinda, yeah, that's Sippa. She also refuses to be babysat, using the Force against anyone who tries to mind her. Sippa isn't too different from a lot of other difficult children, and she'd be extremely averse to being fit into a rigid, uncaring system, but that's not where she is. In the High Republic, Sippa is personally mentored by Jedi Master Yaddle, and instead of being forced to stay at the temple in conditions that she would inevitably resist, Sippa joins Yaddle on missions in the field. Yaddle's patient with Sippa and her questions, and while she's firm with Sippa when necessary, Yaddle is kind and gentle to her, always pushing and prodding her in the right direction. Instead of forcing Sippa into a machine that doesn't have room for her specific behavioral needs, Sippa is given time and attention to flourish and learn in her own way. The Order at the time of the High Republic was built to specifically allow for these type of individual needs. The title of Way Seeker is used to denote a fully trained Jedi that finds their own path as a Force user, independent of the wider structure of the Jedi Order and its council, when that Jedi feels limited by the institution. A Jedi Way Seeker would do what they could to follow where the Force would lead them, to fight tyranny, to seek intense meditation. The Wayseeker role doesn't exist by the time of the Clone Wars, but again, imagine if someone like Anakin had that kind of opportunity. He would have gone and married his wife is what he would have done, and he wouldn't have driven himself crazy about it. So we've largely been talking about individual characters who I think can be comfortably read as somewhat literal depictions of autism or ADHD or something else. But let's zoom out here. Just like people in our world aren't born neurotypical, some people in this world are just Force sensitive in a canonical lore way. The Force can be learned, yeah, but for some people, and most that we see, it is a quality inherent to them. So what if we read all Force sensitives through this semi-allegorical lens? Zine Mrala, also from the High Republic, is a teenage girl. She grew up in a religious commune called the Elders of the Path, which is an organization that speaks of the Force as something that shouldn't be sensed or felt by anyone, that the Force is fire, that to use or steal from the Force is a perversion. The Elders of the Path are themselves descended from another more radical religious order that saw the Jedi embrace of the Force as selfish and the quasi-karmic source of all of the galaxy's suffering.
That is another very Judaism allegory there, unfortunately.
We're going to talk about those guys someday else, but they are a lot. Anyway, Zine is raised in this religious belief, but despite it all, Zine realizes that she is force sensitive. She hopes desperately that her relationship to this power can fade, that she can live normally in her community, and she suppresses those feelings as best as she can. Claudia Amenabar from the podcast RuPaul's Pod Race makes the point that Zine's experience can be easily read as analogous to the types of treatment that autistic or other neurodivergent people experience, where the goal is to cure them of their illness, instead of identifying how autistic people function as being a core part of them, with valid needs and behaviors. Claudia specifically compares it to applied behavior analysis, or ABA, a treatment technique pioneered in the 1960s, which is still often criticized for essentially being cruel.
Autism conversion therapy.
Kinda, yeah. It fundamentally focused on making kids act normal, regardless of what the normality means for the kids' well-being. When a natural disaster, and a group of violent raiders come to her homeworld, Zine senses the danger through the Force connection she has, and she meets another Force-sensitive young woman, a Jedi Padawan her own age. Zine sees the Padawan and her Jedi friends using the Force to help her community. After that, Zine joins the Padawans, at first in defending her homeworld, and then in their further travels. She's seen by her community and her former best friend as something as a heretic who renounces their faith, and in retrospect, she admits to herself that she never felt at home among her people because they'd never accept her for herself. Zine doesn't become a Jedi Padawan, but she learns from them to hone and control her relationship with the Force, and to use it for as much good as she can. She finds real, genuine community and love in the Order, a place full of people like her. Force-sensitive people can be powerful and incredibly gifted, but they, especially as children, are also deeply vulnerable. Force sensitivity is an intense thing to experience, and I expect being force sensitive as a kid can be deeply overstimulating. And it comes with stigma. There are entire religious sects, as mentioned earlier, that see an innate connection to the Force as essentially sinful, despite it being something that some people genuinely can't control.
If we're drawing an allegorical connection to neurodiversity here, then it must be noted that there were and are people in various faiths who believe that being neurodivergent is caused by demon possession.
Fundamentally
Catholics,
sinful.
At sometimes, yeah, it's not great.
And I mean, that can be a political thing too. In the Clone Wars, there's this sense that the Jedi Order is, from the Confederacy side, a force for genuine bad, and from the Republic side, like, some people see them as a dysfunctional part of the Republic war machine. And so that political anger at Jedi can be displaced to Force sensitives as a whole. And that's not even to mention imperial rule. The Galactic Empire sought to erase the Jedi. But with that comes the wider goal, eradication of all cultural and individual Force sensitivity. If we read Force-sensitive people in Star Wars as neurodivergent, then the Empire, through that lens, becomes not just genocidal against a religious order. Yeah, that's bad. Don't get me wrong. But also a eugenicist state that eradicates disabled people. Which, I mean, goes along with the whole deal.
Another, check mark on the "is this just the Nazis" thing.
The Empire is just the Nazis. The Empire's fascist. We've done it.
We solved Star Wars.
We figured it out.
We solved Star Wars, everyone. The Empire is...
Podcast
the Empire
over.
is Nazis.
Precisely. Just wrap it up.
And also America.
The Empire's also America. Yeah, Empire, not good. The fundamental truth of the Jedi and Force sensitive as a whole is that they are almost entirely individuals who are literally, physiologically born different.
They're just built different.
They're literally built different.
They have more mitochondria than other people. You see, they say midichlorians in Star Wars, but they mean mitochondria because, you see, a normal person, you only can have so many powerhouses in your cells. But the Jedi have extra powerhouses in their cells. They have extra powerhouses in their cells, which make them able to move stuff with their brain. And this is my theory of how Star Wars works.
Just like how real-world neurodivergent people are.
Yeah, they have more mitochondria than other people.
And so they can move things with their brain. In the mobile game tie-in novel, we're getting deep, Hunter's Battle for the Arena.
In the mobile game.
It's a book for 13-year-olds. It's okay. I mean, it's got its points. It ties into my thesis. In Hunter's Battle for the Arena, we see the protagonist, Reeve, a young Force-sensitive woman living in a post-imperial world. This is at the point where, the renewed Jedi Order is barely a twinkle in Luke Skywalker's deep-faked eye. Reeve is prone to, in her lowest moments, lashing out with the Force. She pushes people away from her, both figuratively and literally. Her relationship to her Force sensitivity sensitivity is one that she feels she has little control over, and it's tied to her own childhood trauma. Her use of it tends to coincide with emotional breakdowns, and she has a very difficult time handling her connection to this magical power in a healthy way. Karnak Sin is a Force-sensitive kid who comes around like a decade or two after Reeve. When he was 13, he started to have intense headaches and even seizures, during which he'd experienced visions. Kar endured regular bullying at school, where other kids would specifically mock him for his health conditions. As it turns out, Kar has a Force ability called psychometry. If you know Cal Kestis from Jedi Fallen Order or Quinlan Vos from the Clone Wars, you might know this one. A Force user can sometimes have the innate ability to touch an object and see or experience something of the object's past. Kestis and Vos were both trained in the Jedi Order, and neither seems to be hit so violently by the power as Kar does. Kar and Reeve both, I think, would benefit from the sort of structures and care that comes from something like the Jedi Order. It's gone at this point, but the Jedi Order would be a place for people like them, people who are different. Kar could have learned so much from people who knew about his ability, even learning to manage it early on so it wouldn't affect his health so much. Even if neither of them ends up wanting to be a Jedi, having a way to contextualize the way their minds and emotions work, getting to understand those sensitivities could have helped them adjust far more easily to the world in which they live. The Jedi Order, again drawing on Claudia Amenabar's writing, because frankly she fucking nails it, forms a sort of utopian ideal of a community, a system built by disabled people for disabled people as an opportunity for acceptance, to thrive and hone their neurodivergence, not to experience it as just burdensome, but as something that can be channeled and used for personal and social good. The Jedi are seen by a wider galaxy as sometimes inherently suspicious. Why would any group of people have such a strong sense of justice and morality without ulterior motives? But we know that it's a part of them. Jedi literally experience an inherent sense of what they understand to be good and bad.
Oh, and also, like, when you can feel, a planet disappearing from the universe, I imagine that causes sort of...
It affects the way you see planets disappearing from the universe.
Like, wow, that really sucked. Maybe planets disappearing from the universe is bad.
There are lots of occurrences in the books where you'll get a character who's like, the Jedi, I hear you guys, you're always saying you're doing good, but, why? What are your real reasons? And then the Jedi main character is just like, I don't know, we're ontologically good. What else do you want?
I, too, enjoy being just ontologically good.
In the cosmology of this world, we are literally the good guys. The Jedi in their purest form take in kids who are different and offer them a home, a physical and mental outlet, and protection from people who might hurt them for being different. Jedi come from all sorts of backgrounds, and each experiences the Force differently, but neurodivergency exists on a spectrum. The Order gives opportunities for neurodivergent kids to see and learn via a wealth of historical information and training from people who are like them, people who experience the world.
Unless they want to learn about Camino. In which case they are kind of fucked.
You can have any special interest as long as it isn't this one satellite galaxy thing. Shout out to any Kaminoans in the audience.
They could still be around.
The Kaminoans?
Uh-huh.
There are a couple. Lots of them get killed.
Oh, they get genocided.
Yep.
Oh, I don't like that.
That's the Empire, folks.
Genocide is bad.
Where was I? The people that young Jedi are going to be learning from are people who experience the world the same sort of way, who know how to use the cool parts of that and how to handle the hard parts instead of being overwhelmed and lashing out in ways that could harm them or the people around them. Ultimately, disability in the real world is not a superpower, per se, right? The Force tends to allow a Jedi to operate on a higher mental and physical level than the people around them. And though some types of neurodivergence definitely come with qualities that can be an advantage in the right circumstances, a person existing in a world that isn't built for them will often especially struggle, particularly without extra support. But what happens when neurodivergent people get to participate in systems that are truly made by and for people like them, when they're given a respite from an ableist world and allowed to thrive? When we present neurodiverse perspectives in media, people who live that reality get to see and understand the complexities thereof and can genuinely learn about themselves through it. We get the opportunity to see our experiences as diverging from the norm, with benefits and detriments just like any other way we could be, and not just as a dysfunctional variant of an otherwise acceptable life. To reference Delilah Dawson again, she says, kids need to see neurodivergent kids in books. Autistic and ADHD kids deserve adventures, and to see that their uniqueness comes with gifts, not just downsides. And she's right.
There is a reason that literature where kids are different than anyone else or everyone else is so popular, and it's like because that's something that a lot of kids feel.
Well, I think
including neurodivergent kids.
Inherently, it's difficult for a lot of people to feel like they belong and to feel like the systems that they exist in are built for them. And it's capitalism's fault. Okay, now, I think a certain sense of alienation is kind of inherent to the human experience. But at the same time, the kids who are going to be most into, a fantasy action series are the kids who are going to really benefit from stories about people who are different.
I don't know. I very much identified with that as a kid just because, I was also operating a little differently than a lot of people. So,
The level of discomfort and dysfunction that can come from feeling like you're in a world that isn't made for you. I mean, it's something that disabled people feel. It's also something that a lot of queer people feel. It's something that a lot of women feel and a lot of people of color feel. When you have a society that is built on and built for hegemony.
As it turns out, we live in a society.
All right, let's wrap this up. Fern, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can our lovely listeners find you online?
Well, you can find my podcast, Star Wars English Class, wherever pods are cast. And you can follow us on Twitter and TikTok at Swinglish Class. That's SWENGLISHCLASS. We don't post often on the socials, but we do from time to time. And you can find me on Twitter and TikTok at alwaysfern.
Thank you so much for joining us. We'll have to have you back sometime.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight. And until next time.
Go follow Fern and listen to their podcast.
If you want to listen to new episodes as they release, you can find us on most places you can listen to podcasts, on our website, daughtersofferrix.com, or follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at FerrixPod, FERRIXPOD.
New episodes release every other Wednesday, so come back in 2 weeks. God, please
Listener,
come back.
I will break your knees.
Please come back.
I will break your knees. I know where you live.
If you have any questions, suggestions, or corrections, you can send them to our show email, daughtersferrix@gmail.com. I have been Eleanor Mueller. You can find me at The Letter Bomber on most platforms. And Sophie, where can the good people find you?
You can find me on my other podcast, The Red Line Podcast, is about public transportation and trains, on Twitter at @TheRedLine_pod.
Our episodes are written and edited by me, Eleanor Mueller, and Sophia Dunstan. Our podcast art is by Jill Mueller. Our intro and outro music was arranged by me, with themes by Nicholas Bertel and John Williams. Thanks for listening.
I'll break your knee.
Thanks for listening.